Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, you realize I can't hear you. That's part of the problem. So, good afternoon. My name is Andy Joss. I'm head of solutions and data governance for a company called Informatica. We're an enterprise cloud data management company. This afternoon, I'm going to talk to you about what's been going on in the world of data governance and why data governance is now actually quite a hot topic for many organizations and across a number of different industries. I'm going to start with a little bit of a step back and a little bit of a scene set just to give you a sense on what we're seeing where our organizations are around their use of data. And I go back a little bit in time, and yes, I'm old enough to remember all of this, back in the days of punch cards. Anyone else in the room remember punch cards? Yeah, absolutely. Not many people is the honest answer. But the point being is when we went back in time, we had applications and the data was very much held in the applications. And what's happened over time is that we've matured in our thinking and we've matured in our understanding of the value of data. And today, what we're seeing is many organizations are either at what we call the data 3.0 era. They're either at that point or they're on that journey. And this is where data is fundamentally transforming what organizations do. And I'm going to give you some examples of what I mean by that in a minute. So this is either a place where organizations are, or this is part of a destination for many organizations. And that's a really important point because it comes back to the role of data and what it means to us in terms of how we're going to drive our organizations and our businesses forward. Just to give you a little bit of a sense in what's happening though, just around some of the constructs of data, and I'm sure you've seen lots of different statistics fired at you both there yesterday and today. Just kind of give you a little bit of a heads up on some of the things that we're seeing. On the left hand side, the amount of global data center traffic per annum, 15.3 zettabytes. I don't know where the 0.3 came from. I can't even conceptualize what a zettabyte is. It's just got lots of noughts. So I tend to look at that and just think, that's a lot of data, as in a heck of a lot of data. We've got new organizations, new business users, new communities of people who are now interested in data. It's no longer the purview of the IT department or the data department or certain key parts of organizations. Pretty much everyone's starting to get into the world of data, and they need to understand and manage and work with that data. And we're now also living in a much more connected world. I guess there's probably more connected devices in this space now than there are people. I certainly know I've got 2 of them on me, and that's probably the same for many of you. And each one of these is potentially generating huge amounts of data. Certainly the health data that my tracker generates is a significant amount. So we're going to see lots of devices, lots of connectivity generating more data, more insights that we want to generate from that, more traffic from the cloud, and then the rise and the adoption of some of these new hot technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning to help us make sense and understand what's going on in the world of data. So we've got this shift into wanting to do more with data because we recognize that we need to do that. We've also got these challenges and constraints of what's influencing organizations in terms of the data that they've got. But fundamentally what we're seeing is organizations are using data to go through some kind of digital transformation journey, or just a transformation journey. Now this varies by industry, it can vary by sub-industry, and sometimes it's a very personal experience for an individual organization. Increasingly though, what we're seeing is organizations recognizing that standing still in 2017 is like going backwards. So therefore data now becomes really an asset we really have to manage extremely well to take advantage of. And if we think about what digital transformation may mean for organizations, things like new business models, for example. It was only a few years back that when you were purchasing car insurance, then actually the one time you talked to an insurer is when they captured your information, they gave you a price, you took out your policy, and then you paid for your premium, and you probably didn't speak to them again for 12 months, hopefully. That's changed now that we've got smart boxes in cars that effectively are tracking what we do, where we go, and how we drive, in terms of giving us a better service level, but potentially also better pricing as well, better insights, of course, for the insurers. That fundamentally changes the market, these kind of new business models, and also drives things like new business processes, new ways of engaging with organizations, the rise of new data services. So to give an example, I travel a lot. One of the things that happens to me a lot is I can turn up in a country, I can get in a taxi, I can try to pay for the taxi with my credit card, and I get that horrible feeling when the credit card is denied. The reason being is my credit card company's going, hang on a second, you were here 1 minute and now you're over there. Is that okay? And in most cases, the answer is yes. So what are new data services? Well, it'd be really handy, actually, when I arrive in a new country, when I get my smartphone out and I authenticate myself, while I'm authenticating through the phone, why can that information not go to my credit card company and confirm that I am in the country where the transaction was taking place? Seems really simple. Actually, it's massive value to me in doing that, and you need the processes to support that. You also have new users of data. We're going to touch on a little bit on GDPR, the new General Data Protection Regulation. But what we're seeing is, for example, the legal community are now getting engaged in data. The privacy community are now much more engaged and are key stakeholders in the data journey. We're seeing new applications and new infrastructure, whether it be new purpose-built applications, whether it be new infrastructure such as technology in the cloud. And then finally, we're also seeing new forms of regulation. So we have that here in the form of GDPR. We're also going to have the new UK version of that come into force and all the changes that that brings with that. But across the territory, what we're seeing is a lot of change going on, and digital transformation is kind of the overall bracket of how we're describing that. And some organizations, it's all of these. For some, it's just part of. But the key point about all of that is data is the foundation for making all of that happen, I would argue. The reason being it's very hard to do any of these things without the right data. So therefore, if data is important and it's the key to transformation, how we control and manage that data, the governance of that data, is equally as important. So that's kind of point number one for today. Data governance is really important right now because of the requirement for data as part of our transformation journey. Now, if I think about kind of 4 key drivers as to why data governance has suddenly become such a hot topic, let me just give you a few of those. The first one is that organizations, as I've mentioned, are genuinely seeing data as being a strategic asset. So I was with 2 of my customers recently. I look after financial services, 2 insurance companies. They sell similar products to similar types of customer in similar markets, kind of in similar ways and for similar price points. So how, as a consumer of those products, how do you differentiate between the two? Well, actually, it may just come down to price if that's the only thing you can see as being different. My argument would be is actually, as an insurer, you know a lot about me. So how do you turn that knowledge into something that is of value to me as a potential customer? So thinking about data as an asset, organizations are genuinely going, do you know what? We talked about it for a long time, but now we get why it really is an asset. We've talked a little bit about some of the new consumers. So we're probably finding actually that everybody in this room is either or about to be a new consumer of this data. So when the General Data Protection Regulation comes into force, we will have the opportunity to go and make requests of organizations that hold our data. We're now active participants in the world of the management and governance of data. Data-centric regulation, GDPR being a good example. And this last point is about the growth and type of data. That's just coming in at massive amounts, and it's getting worse every day, or better, depending upon your viewpoint. Now, the point being is data in huge volumes on its own, I would argue, has a set amount of value. When we apply governance to that data, I would argue that the value of that data goes up exponentially. And the reason I would argue that is through one word: trust. I can have data, but if I don't trust it, it's no good to me. And data governance, I would argue, is about how we engender trust in data. Now, organizations are going, well, this is great, Andy. We want to do more with data. Yeah, I get that. But actually, is there value in doing it? We've been talking about data governance for 25 years, or in my case, 30 years. What's the value? There's got to be some value. I mean, it's been a struggle to answer that. So let me give you 4 simple examples of how organizations are looking at the value of governing their data. So the first example, you're almost certainly not going to be able to read. Don't worry, because from where I'm standing, I can't read it either. So let me explain to you what that says. It says organizations are trying to use technology and processes and procedures to manage data today. If you make a simple statement that says, we're going to stop doing that in a very disparate, disconnected way, and we're going to join everything together, actually, we can save a lot of money. We can save a lot of money by the fact that all these bespoke applications we built, we don't need them anymore. We don't need to maintain them anymore. All these custom solutions that we built, well, actually, we don't have to have these anymore. We can start to use technology around the governance of data to physically save ourselves some money, help on that operational efficiency journey. Another aspect of governance, of course, is around the quality of data. We can use data quality to improve how we operationally use processes. Here's an example of one organization that just looked at how they tracked the cost impact of the quality of data as data flowed through their organization. At the top part of that chart, as data comes in, if there are data quality problems, the impact is small. The reason being is the data is not being used for anything. By the time it gets to the data usage process, the end of, where this is being used for management decisions, for strategic decisions, the cost implications for this particular organization ran into the millions of euros. Significant amounts. So data quality, which is part of the world of governance, again drives value in its own right. I would also argue that data governance gives me the opportunity of doing things like analytics, reporting, next-gen analytics, however you want to describe it. I think we can do that better, and I think we can do that faster. So the way I would argue that is that most data science teams, and I speak to a lot of those because I cover financial services, they spend around about 80% of their working day finding and fixing data problems, and about 20% of their day of actually doing data science and next-gen analytics. That's criminal. Absolutely criminal. So if I have good data governance at an enterprise level, key takeaway number 2 today is enterprise data governance. What I've now got is I've got the ability as a data scientist or team to have one place to go to know everything about the data I'm interested in. I can take my 80% time and I can shrink it, and I would argue you could probably shrink that down to a quarter of that time, probably down to 20%. Now, if I can do that, I can do more data science projects per annum. So from a business viewpoint, here's an example. This was a single data scientist basically doing that 80-20 reduction, taking the 80% down to 20. Rather than doing 7 projects a year, that data scientist is doing 18 projects a year. So whatever the value from each one of those additional projects, that's money for our organization in terms of savings or in terms of the way of generating money. So data governance is helping drive the agenda for how we make money too. And then the final example is something that is very popular, particularly amongst marketing departments in organizations. So this is an example of an organization, relatively small number of customers, where they're making offers. And if you're in the world of marketing, getting offer acceptance is one of those key things that you're interested in. And it's about making the right offer at the right place and at the right time. And I would argue that if you have governance over your data, you now know everything about the data that you're using for your offers. You should be able to increase your offer take-up rate, because your offer take-up rate will be dependent upon what you're offering and at what point and at what time. And your governance should be able to help you answer some of those questions, whether it's right or not. So if I can take my offer take-up rate from 1% to 1.5%, for this organization, that's 1.5 million euros a year. So the reason I've taken you through all of that is actually organizations are not just seeing data as being a strategic asset, which is why governance is important, but actually data governance drives material value for organizations as well. So it's no longer one of those things that the IT department had to do. This is something that's helping drive our businesses forward and helps us make money. So that's kind of takeaway number 2. So we talk about something we call intelligent data governance, and it's about how we enable all of those things to happen. And here are the 5 key parts to that. The first one is about collaboration. Data governance used to be an IT problem. It's not. It's a business problem, which means that we have business and IT need to be working together, and all parts of the stakeholder organization working together. So this point about collaboration is really important. The second part then is about connecting their view of data. If I'm sitting in the business, what data am I interested in? Well, I may be sitting looking at regulations, I may be defining policies, I may have business processes that I'm executing, I may have a glossary of terms that my business uses, so we're all using consistent terminology. If I'm sitting in IT, I'm dealing with databases, tables, systems, transformations. I'm dealing with quite different things. And the point about collaboration is my collaboration has to span both of those worlds. So I have to be able to connect what happens in the world of business and their business view of data with what happens in the technology, in the technical world of data. When I can do that, I now have visibility of my data from top to bottom or bottom to top. And that's how I can justify the statements I made earlier about how organizations could start to use this to make money. Acting with authority and confidence. Remember the word I used earlier, trust. So if people trust the data, they will instinctively and naturally do better things with it. The reason being is it takes away one variable from the equation. Give you an example of that. I was with an insurance company fairly recently. The people who were doing the pricing for their premiums, they were telling me that they didn't have 100% confidence in the data they were being given, so they were increasing the price of their premiums, not by a massive amount, but by a small amount, just to cover the fact that if there were problems with the data, they didn't want to underprice the premium, so they'd rather overprice it. Okay, that's one way of solving the problem. I would argue that's the symptom, not the problem. Point being, as organizations, when you give them trust in the data, they will do much better things with it. We talk about reporting and attainment over time. Let me give you an example of data quality in terms of the context of how this applies potentially to organizations. If I have a business process, order to cash as being an example, and there are problems with what comes out at the end in terms of the reconciliation, what I would actually like to know is, in the context of that process, I would like to understand the quality of the data that that process consumes at every step of the process. So when we talk about attainment, it's also about measuring things, and data quality is a good example of how we measure things. And the last point, horrible expression, but a really good expression, is about the democratization of data. It's data for everybody, by everybody. And let me give you an example of how that works in the real world. Quick show of hands. Who in here uses TripAdvisor? Okay, there's a few people that didn't, but that's okay, that's not a problem. So I travel a lot. I use TripAdvisor a lot. So think to yourself, why does TripAdvisor work? Well, you think about what they did, is they put together a platform, a consistent way of working. They gave people the ability to quickly find information after it's been classified and categorized. They gave people the ability to generate insights. They gave people the ability to collaborate, to contribute, not in a completely free-form way, but in a measured way. And they gave you a system of rewards and value for doing that. Take that concept, take that idea now, and apply that to data in your organizations. And that's what intelligent data governance gives you. Same concepts, with the same sense of value in its own right. Whoop, click too far. Third point, takeaway from today. We talk about business data governance and technical data governance. These do exist in separate worlds. This is only going to work, we're only going to truly get the value from our data when we connect those worlds together. And you may be thinking to yourself, wow, that sounds like a tall order, Andy. Well, let me give you some examples. In many organizations, you will have a list of things like processes, for example. Process maps, fantastic. Inside those process maps, you'll probably have some idea of what data is inside the process and what systems manage that data. How about I can take that information and not just say, you think it's this system, but actually it's these 10 things over here, and it's these 50 pieces of information over here. If I can join those two together and use some clever technology like AI, for example, that's going to make your life easier. You've now got a link between your view of the data and actually how it's used and consumed. So the data consumer is probably, I would argue, now probably the most important person on this slide, and my apologies to anybody else who sits in one of these other areas. It's not to say you're not important, you are. This is all about the consumer, the people who are going to help drive value from this. So we've got to think about the new way of using data and about connecting the business and the IT world of data together. So we call this enterprise unified metadata intelligence. Horrible mouthful, yes, I know. Let me explain what that means. So the first thing being is that we think about the technical metadata. What type of system is it? You know, what type of big data system is it? How is the data stored? What does it look like? How do I classify and categorize it? What are the data attributes, et cetera, et cetera? So things we have to live with. I've also got the business view of data. What are my business processes? What are my business policies? How do I define my rules? What data am I using through my glossary? I also want to know how data is being consumed and accessed. How often is this data actually being used? Because if it's not being used, why not? Maybe actually I'm looking at the wrong data, something as simple as that. And I want to look at usage information, who's using it and for what purpose. Now when I can bring all that together, as a consumer of data, I suddenly have the keys to the game. Because I now know for all of the data in my enterprise that I care about, I know all the constituent pieces of information, the metadata about that data. Now I understand what I'm doing with it. I can understand the risks I may or may not be taking with it. I understand how it's going to drive value for me. So that's how we approach it, by joining the metadata world of these different environments together, and we use technologies like AI to do that. And you're probably thinking to yourself, okay, Andy, you've mentioned big data once so far, and this is obviously a big data event. And I said this at a conference last week, bit of a contentious point, but data governance is about data. It's not just about big data. It's about small data, if that's what you want to call it. It's about data on-premise and in the cloud. It's about data at rest and data at motion. If I'm sitting in the business, I care about data. I don't care what it sits on, how it's used, where it is. I want to know everything about that data so I know how I can use it and whether I can trust it or not. So we need to have some technology to help us do that. And that's effectively what this picture is talking to. So you can see the governance piece up here. Just about see that, talk about data governance. And you can see the different attributes across the top. So I would argue, although this is a big data conference, data governance is just about data. Big data is an important part of that because we've got so many big data projects going on, particularly in the world of GDPR, which we'll touch on in a second. But this is about the governance of all data, whether it be on-premise, in the cloud, whether it be legacy applications or Excel spreadsheets sitting on people's desktops. We need to understand what that data is and what we can do with that data. Can we build trust in it? So we need a platform to do that. And just to give you a sense as to how this plays out a little bit, then thinking about our platform is based on something called Claire, which is our artificial intelligence technology. This is about how we get access to that data in the first place. Now, as you can imagine, we're a software vendor, so getting access to our own data, yeah, we can do that, obviously. Getting access to other people's data is just as important, because remember, this is about data. It's not just big data. It's not just data that we manage. It's data that organizations manage. So I need to think about how I bring in data from other products that's similar to our own, and a whole raft of other technologies that people may or may not be deploying in their organization. So why am I showing you this? Big data has fantastic value to deliver. Our challenge with data governance is we have to deal with the messy reality of the way businesses are structured. Whether they've grown through acquisition, whether they made strategic decisions about particular applications or particular business processes, organizations are just inherently messy. And we need to cope with that, because in the data governance world, that is our landscape. So being able to cope with that messiness becomes really, really important. And being able to connect to that data, and you can see the big data platforms here on the left, or at least you could if the pointer was working, it gives you a sense that big data is part of this story. An important part of the story, but part of the story. And I'm just going to touch a little bit on probably one of the hottest use cases for data governance, and in some respects for big data as well, which is the new EU General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. Comes into full force 25th of May next year. Actually, it's a really good example of how organizations are now, in some respects, having to look at data. Even if reluctantly they're thinking data being an asset, actually with GDPR, particularly around personal data, organizations are now having to think, well, there's potentially some large fines associated with getting things wrong for GDPR. There's potentially some serious reputational damage if I'm not looking after my personal data. I mean, let's be honest, who would have wanted to have been the chief executive of Equifax about 6 weeks ago? Probably nobody in this room. And I would argue that actually, if we're going to be thinking about something like GDPR, that was an example of one of these new data-centric regulations, then actually we just need to come back to some basics. And the reason I say that is this all applies to data governance. So those of you familiar with GDPR, you'll recognize some of these questions. So, Do I know what data I have, who has access to it, and for what purpose? It's a really simple question. Actually, in most organizations, really difficult to answer. But if I'm thinking about GDPR, I need to understand how I answer that question, whether my data be sitting on a legacy system or whether it be sitting on a big data platform. That's fundamental to data governance. Do I know what all of the in-scope data is? In-scope data, by the way, just says for any organization, what's the important personal information to you? It might be your customer data, could be your employee data. If you're in the B2B world, it might be your client data. All different things. If you're in the public sector, you may be holding data about volunteers, for example. Potentially all of this stuff is in scope. So where is it? It sits everywhere. And quite often we don't even know it's there. So actually just being able to know where my data is, what it is, and what I can do with it, actually that's a really important thing from a GDPR viewpoint. Actually, you'll notice that's also part of what we need for data governance as well, helping me build that view of trust. We have another part of GDPR, which is around the ability to enable rights and consent management. Consent management being that process under which we are asking individuals for their permission or their consent to use their data for a particular purpose. Sounds like it's something very specific to GDPR, but actually from a data governance viewpoint, this is really useful information to know, because what it tells me as a consumer of data is what I'm allowed to do with that data and the wishes of the person who gave me that data in the first place. And the last part is about having protection and controls. We need to have protection and controls. Data privacy by design is part of how it's described in the regulation, but actually just having protection and control around my data. It's really important from a governance viewpoint, because now if I have some data, say some testing data, rather than using production data, I'm using masked data. That's a really important thing to know from a governance viewpoint, because that's one less thing I have to worry about. It helps build trust in that final model. So these are the four big questions that we hear from organizations around data specific to GDPR. They're all very relevant to data governance. This is how we approach it. And you notice there's a line at the top that talks about this thing called data governance. I would argue all of this is about the governance of data. It's relevant for all of these different aspects. There's just different technologies for how you pull all this information together to help you build that model of trust for your organization. And the big question I get asked a lot is, Andy, that's great. You're suggesting that people spend time, effort, and money in doing things for GDPR, but actually we're business people, we're clever people, and we don't want to spend that money just to be compliant with GDPR. What I'd actually like to do is use it to drive value for my organization. So what else is this going to do for me? And here's 4 examples. So if I'm going to go to the trouble of, in this particular case, deploying some technology to help with my governance environment, actually I can do things like better compliance reporting, I can do faster data science, as in the example I gave you earlier, all the way through to driving that data as an asset agenda. If I now know for GDPR purposes where all of my in-scope data is, I can use that exact same capability for other types of policies such as PII, PEI, PCI, PHI, and so on. I can reuse these technologies for other business value purposes. If I'm sitting in a marketing department and I'm worried about subject access requests and consent management for GDPR, I can reuse those same capabilities to help drive my customer centricity program, because they're built on the same conceptual ideas. And if I'm going to be using technology to help my GDPR program around how I put control around my data, well, actually, I can use that in my business to help cut the costs of things like testing. So why am I telling you all of this? Reason being is that GDPR is something we have to live with. It's coming and it's not very far away. It's a really good example of why governance is a really important topic right now, but it's not the only reason. And it's not the only reason organizations are significantly investing in governance as a capability, but across the enterprise. So, what have we just taken you through? So the first part, that is, I think that organizations have truly woken up to data being a business asset. And it doesn't matter whether the data is sitting on a Hadoop cluster, whether it's sitting in the cloud, whether it's sitting in an Excel spreadsheet, or it's sitting in a legacy mainframe system, it's still data. And it's data that we have to govern to help us drive the value from it. If that's the case, then data governance is therefore important, because data is important. Seems obvious. So trust has never been more important than it's been now, as we mentioned earlier. But we have to deal with the messy reality of the way organizations are and the way they work. So intelligent data governance is enabling us to do exactly that. We're not looking at it in one dimension, we're looking at it in multiple dimensions, whichever way the organization needs to look at that. Which means that we have to govern all data, not just big data. So I hope you found that useful. I hope it gives you a sense that data governance is a hot topic right now. It has a material relevance in what happens in the big data world, but this is about data. So data governance is all about data, not just big data. Thank you.